Hello, good morning everybody, or good afternoon if it's afternoon in your part of the world. I'm Jonathan Thompson and I'm going to be talking to you for the next wee while. So we're going to talk about PASS, which stands for Pupil Attitudes to Self and School. And from that, the first question is, why would we be interested in measuring attitudes? Psychologists will always tell you that attitudes are very important, but they're difficult to measure. But they are important because, as you can see on this slide, if you have an attitude to something, anything, it affects how you feel about it, how you act towards it, and how you think about it. So if we put that into an educational context, those are three key areas: the affective, behavioral, and cognitive areas of learning. So attitudes are very important. Let me just give you a bit of background to PASS. PASS was developed about 10 years ago by a group of educational psychologists, and for the last 2.5 years it's been part of GL Assessment, which is a division of the GL Education Group. PASS took 6 years to develop, and it involved 4 universities and about 20 local authorities, so a huge amount of research going in there. But probably more important than that was that it involved a very large number of children during the development. So in a sense, it's a form of pupil voice, long before pupil voice and pupil attitudes were being regarded by other people. It developed into a product because after several presentations at educational seminars and forums, people started coming up afterwards at the end and asking where they could get a hold of it. So that was how it became a product as opposed to a research project. And the growth in our use of PASS is generally through high recommendation from one customer to another. And of course we have excellent customer care. You wouldn't expect me to say anything else. So let's look at another triangle now. Why attitudes are important within education. As you can see from this triangle, we've got attainment in the top green triangle there. Everybody is trying to get the best for our children in schools, and we want them to attain the best that they can. In order for them to attain, they need to come into school, so attendance is very important too. And we believe that by measuring attitudes, we can influence positively both attendance and through that into attainment separately as well. And if we achieve both of those, then we are going to hopefully improve the life chances of our students as they go through the education system and out into the world beyond. Let's take a few moments to look at the audit process. It's quite simple really, it doesn't take very much to do that. The first stage is getting your students to do the survey, and as you'll see in the top line there of stage 1, I think it's very, very important that staff and pupils are clearly briefed on what you're doing. So your staff need to know what PASS is all about, why you're doing it, who's going to be involved in it, and afterwards who's going to be involved in the follow-up afterwards. Equally with your pupils, it's very important that they understand that this is not an exam, that they can pass or fail, that it's an opportunity for the school to find out how they feel about themselves and their education, so that the school can make the opportunities as good as possible for them. Pupils can do the survey in groups if you have ICT facilities, so you can get a class of students into a room and have them all do the survey at the same time. If you're a statistician, you'll understand the next line, the 4 AFC 50-item rating scale. And for those of us that aren't statisticians, what that means is the students are going to read 50 sentences or statements and choose a comment on those from a choice of 4. So that's the 4 alternative forced choice AFC, which means that they can choose either yes a little, yes a lot, no, yes a bit, no not much, and no not at all. So they've only got 4 choices on each of those statements. It'll take a student about 15 to 20 minutes to complete the survey. The reading age of those statements is from chronological age 7, and we have many foreign language translations so that people can do it in a language of their choice. We also offer support for children who have learning difficulties or visual impairment to enable them to take the survey too. As your students are taking the survey and beyond afterwards, there's a secure area for you as a staff member to go into. Within there, you can track which pupils have taken the survey and have completed it. You can check their names and some of their personal details, such as their gender, date of birth, year group, ethnicity, and so on. And then at the end, when all of your students have done it, you can click Notify to let us know that you're ready for your report. Very important that you do click Notify, because otherwise we won't know that you're ready. Once your survey's gone through, it will be a matter of minutes really for your survey to be available, your report to be available. You'll get an email which will have a link to a download, and from there you get your report, which will have a PDF document which will give you information about the whole school, the cohorts, gender breakdown and so on. And you'll also get some Excel data, or data that's given to you about the individual students within Excel, and I'll talk a lot more about that in just a few minutes. Now, for us, very exciting news is that in September we will be moving PASS from its current server onto our GL assessment server, which is known as TestWise. And most of our assessments within GL are hosted on TestWise. This will give us an opportunity to link with your management information system so that student personal information can be downloaded directly into the survey, which means that your children don't have to do that. We'll take this opportunity to refresh the appearance of the survey screens, and we'll be putting in audio at all levels. Currently, audio is only available for the youngest children. The surveys will go through automatically, but probably the most exciting part of this is that once PASS is on TestWise, we will then be able to offer integration of PASS data with other assessment data that may be on there, such as the cognitive abilities test, progress in English, progress in maths, and other assessments. At that point, all the PASS products will be on TestWise. Now, at the heart of PASS, there are 9 attitudinal factors, or areas, if you like. Those 50 statements that I was talking about earlier feed into these 9 factors, and these are the areas that are different attitudinal areas that we're going to measure. So let me run through these, because these are probably the most important part of PASS. I'm going to move around the factors a bit, so I hope I don't confuse you with that. But let's start with number 1, feelings about school. This measures how a child feels as they come into school. Do they feel safe and happy to be there, or perhaps not? A low score would suggest that a child does not feel that way, perhaps feels a bit neglected, maybe is being bullied, is certainly not happy about coming into school. You can use this measure for a number of reasons. For example, if you are thinking of running an anti-bullying campaign, or perhaps an equal opportunities campaign, you could use PASS to measure the children's attitudes before the campaign, run your campaign, and then measure again afterwards. And that will help to show you whether there's been a difference achieved by your campaign. You could also use it if you're changing the buildings around, the infrastructure, the environment around the student. If you're lucky enough to be building a new school or adding new buildings, this has an impact on how students feel about their school. So again, using PASS will enable you to measure the impact of your building work. So if factor 1 is about the bricks and mortar around the student, factor 5 is about the people. Attitudes to teachers is really the well-being factor here, and measures how a student or a child feels about the staff that are working around them. I should point out that there's nothing here to individualize the staff. There's no opportunity to write in a staff member's name or any comment. They simply have those 4 choices to click on. I should also say that this factor, attitudes to teachers, is one of the highest scoring factors that we have. So you can relax a bit in the knowledge that children actually do like their teachers. However, a low score here would suggest that a child perhaps feels the teacher involved is a bit aloof, perhaps not listening to them, not paying attention to them. whereas a high score here would suggest that the student is quite happy with the staff around them. So if 1 and 5 are looking outwards from the student, let me go back to number 2 now, because we're going to turn that around and look into the student's mind to find out how they feel about themselves within a learning context. Perceived learning capability asks the child to comment on their recent learning experiences, whether these have been good and they feel ready to take on the world, or whether they've been bad and they feel a bit of a failure. As those recent experiences build up, we then get a longer measure, which is self-regard as a learner. Now, it's important to point out that this is not self-esteem. Self-esteem is a very broad measure, and we all need self-esteem, but self-esteem can also be quite challenging for children with very, very high self-esteem. They obviously feel that they're right and it's the rest of the world that's wrong. So what we're measuring here is self-regard as a learner, so we've narrowed it down into the learning context. Factor 4 is preparedness for learning, and this measures whether a child feels that they have been prepared in the metacognitive sense of how to learn. Have they been provided with the skills? They've been taught how to learn. And there's an interesting correlation here, because we can link this with behavioral difficulties. And so you could possibly hypothesize from that if a child comes into the classroom and feels they haven't been able to cope with the learning that's being carried out in the classroom because they're not skilled up, then they're going to be thinking about how to fill up the next 20, 30, 40 minutes, and quite possibly that will result in behavioral difficulties. The answer to this is good, though, because if you use an intervention strategy such as targeted study support, not only will this help the child to catch up with the rest of the class in terms of learning skills, but by occupying their time in this way, you'll find that there is a very beneficial effect also on any behavioral difficulties that may have been there beforehand. We've looked at number 5, so let's go on to number 6 now. This is the first of 2 motivational or aspirational measures that we have. General work ethic measures something that is actually bigger than school. It's about life in general, and this is measuring if a child has connected that working hard is good for them and good for their life opportunities. A linking one from this, I suppose, would be number 9, which is also an aspirational or motivational factor, but is putting it into more of an academic context. Here, we are trying to find out if a child has worked out that working hard in school is good for them. And you'll often find that there are interesting comparisons between factors 6 and 9 as to whether a child has connected academically or just generally, vocationally with work. Quite often you may find in a secondary school that the children who have started doing weekend work, or perhaps working in a family business or doing a paper round, will have a very high general work ethic, but they may question as to why they need to learn history and French, and therefore their factor 9 scores may be quite low. Equally, gifted and talented children quite often have a very high factor 9 score, but may well not have thought about their career or their life after school, and hence have quite a low factor 6 score. So going back now to confidence in learning, this is all about stickability and perseverance in the face of a challenge. Very important that our children learn how to cope with challenges and not bring down self-imposed barriers when faced with a challenge. Quite often in maths you may find that children will say, I can't do this because I don't do maths when faced with a new challenge. But it's important that they learn how to cope with challenges, because challenges don't stop when they leave school. Finally, attitudes to attendance. This is not actually whether a child is in school. You have that in your register. This is really measuring what's going on in their heads. Do they want to come into school, and when they're there, do they want to stay there? I'm going to come back to this later on, but it's a very important factor that we can use in a number of different ways. So those are the 9 factors. I hope you're all comfortable with that. For an individual, when you've got those scores are in from their survey, you would end up with something like this in terms of this bar chart. Perhaps not this one, which is a little bit extreme, but nevertheless you would have a bar chart that would show for an individual how they score across the 9 factors. So those are the 9 factors across the bottom, and up the side is a percentile score. And a percentile score enables us to place each child on a score between 0 and 100 in the context of the national average, the national standard, if you like. We've standardized pass using a huge database of 600,000 records, and this shows how each individual sits within there. So let me try and explain that a little bit more. If you look at the factor 9 score, which is very low, if that was a score of 2, then that would mean that that pupil is scoring above only 1% of their peers nationally and below 98%. If we looked at factor 7 over there, for example, if that's a 40% score, percentile score, that would mean they were scoring above 39% of their peers nationally and below 60%. I hope that's making some sense to you. Let me tell you, let me just go back for a moment here. This actually is a case study, this bar chart here, and this was a young lad who was having behavioural difficulties in school, was about to be sent away excluded to a special school. We used PASS to measure his attitudes, and what came out of it was a profile like this. Now, having talked to the young person involved, it turned out that there were all sorts of problems going on in his life, and so there were some quite justifiable reasons as to why his attitudes were the shape they are that's shown on that bar chart. What the school did was then to put in some intervention in order to try and help this young lad. So let me tell you more about what they did. For factors 2 and 3, where, if you remember, that's all about his self-regard, his confidence in himself as a learner, they put in 2 types of mentoring. One was with peer mentoring with other students in the class who gave him honest feedback about the work that he was doing. They also gave him an opportunity to have a mentoring session with 2 adults of his choice, where he could really talk about anything that was going on in his life and bothering him. But it enabled him to get that off his chest in a mentoring session rather than during the class when the teacher is trying to run a lesson for everybody. For factor 4, they put in some targeted study support, and if you remember, this is about making sure that a student has the skills to enable them to engage in the learning process. And by doing that, they enabled him to catch up with his peers and get back up to speed with them, but also to engage him in the lessons again so that he wasn't able to find time to chat and be disruptive because he was busy with the lessons. Finally, they also gave him some reading and numeracy support, again linking with the targeted study support to bring up his skills. So a group of interventions there that those interventions were able to re-engage this young lad in the education process that he was in, and actually in this real case study he went on, rather than being excluded, he went on and stayed right through school and went on into vocational college. We often get asked about a pre and post survey result. In these diagrams here, there are 2 surveys done on a young lad in primary school who again was excluded for behavioural difficulties, so very low. Really doesn't tell us very much at all, other than that there is something terribly wrong going on in this child's attitudes. However, the school that he was sent to put in some intervention, and the score on the chart on the right is done only 12 weeks later. And I think you'll agree, looking at that there has been a massive difference. This isn't a perfect chart by any means, but nevertheless I would say, looking at that this child now feels that they're being listened to, somebody cares about them, somebody is interested in them, and they have re-engaged. And I can tell you, again, this is a real case study. This young man was able to be reintegrated back to his mainstream school and continue his education from there. So what I'm trying to show you with these terms of attainment as to where their ability suggests they ought to be, then a very effective way of trying to find out why that might be would be then to look at your past scores to find out if there's an attitudinal issue that we can affect and influence in order to bring down or remove a barrier to that child's learning so that they can fulfill their ability and attain to the highest level. So again, using past scores with other scores is an excellent way of identifying barriers, and we'll look at that again later on. So you've done your survey, you sent it off to us, and we've sent you now a report. So let's spend a few minutes just looking at the report and how you might be able to interpret your results. The chart I'm looking at here is probably one of the first charts would be a whole school chart. So this is averaging out your children across the whole schools. It's looking at the 9 factors again across the bottom there, percentile, actually in this case, sorry, percentage scores, because these are averages across the whole school up the left-hand side. Now this top bar chart here is really measuring how you as a school are doing in isolation from the rest of the world. This is just about you and your school. And I always encourage people to have a look at that first and look at the high scores before you look at the low scores, and celebrate what your children are to you and saying, this is good in our school, we like this, we're happy with this. From there you can, if you like, look at the lower scores and then work out how you can make some improvements with intervention from there. Below that there is an Excel line of scores. Now these are percentile scores, so these are putting your school's scores in context with other 0.3% score in percentile terms. That means that if that was 40%, 60% of schools are scoring above 70% percentage-wise, and that would mean that a small improvement in the 70% score could probably lead to quite a large improvement in your percentile score. If that doesn't make any sense, do please email your questions into us and I'll attempt to try and explain that in more depth later on. What I would say though is that when you're sharing this data with staff across the school, probably the senior leadership team, maybe your directors and governors would like to look at the percentile scores in the bottom here to see how you're doing in context to other schools. But in terms of teaching staff, heads of year, heads of subject, top chart is really the one that's most important. Equally, when you come to a comparison from one year or one survey to another, it's that top chart that I think is really important, because that's where you will see how improvements have been made within your school. Looking further down and moving on to the Excel spreadsheet, so I should say that actually, sorry, let me go back to that for a moment. As well as the whole school, you will get data like this for individual year groups, for gender groups, for ethnic groups, and combinations of those. So you can start to drill down from your whole school score into the scores below to find out where you need to focus your possible interventions. So moving on to the individuals, you then have a chart, an Excel spreadsheet with each individual's name, their year group, their tutor group, not shown on this chart, but this is just an example, and then some scores, percentile scores across the 9 factors for each individual child. They're color-coded in order to help you see easily how the patterns are. The color coding is not critical. Actually, we've improved our color coding now to 4 colors. So as well as red, amber and green, we've got another color in there as well, a sort of brown color, and our measure, those go up to 30%. So we've got 0 to 5, 6 to 20, and 20 to 30, and then 30 above. Now the reason for those colors is simply to help you get a feel for how the numbers work, and also to help you identify quickly those that you want to work with. That's not to say that anybody with a green score you can ignore. If you look at Brian there on the 3rd line down, his score in factor 2 of 20.5 would suggest that probably you would want to deal with him as if he was an amber score. And with our new 4 colors colouring, he would actually be in the amber. You'll also find there are some really nice surprises amongst the green. And quite a lot of schools that we work with use those green scores. They identify the children who are scoring high and get them to work together with those children who are scoring low to see if they can help each other. But looking across the rows will give you the individual scores for each pupil. Looking down the columns will give you average scores for a class. So it's in Excel to enable you to sort and work with this data, both within PASS on its own and also with other assessment data that you may have as well. And sorting is a really key part of how you work with your PASS data. On our website, you will find that there are a number of very good tutorials that will help you if you're not comfortable with working with Excel. They're really Excel tutorials that set in the context of PASS data, and I hope you'll find them very helpful. If there are areas where you would like to have more help, then do contact us. We can either help you directly or possibly even create another video for you to work with. So, sorting data. What I've done here is I'm going to sort on self-regard, which is column F, in order to see in as you plan your interventions. Now, I mentioned that attitude is a key area for us to measure. We did some research a few years ago. We took a sample of 1,500 children and measured their factor 8, their score, their attitude to attendance. 12 months later, we went back and measured this as well and correlated it with their actual attendance, and what we found that the correlation was 0.9, which is very, very high. In other words, 9 out of 10 students who had a low factor 8 score had started to truant 12 months later. And this is really quite a high score. So what I'm suggesting to you is that if you can link this, if you can start to look at factor 9, you will identify children who are likely to start truanting in the future, and you can intervene before they start voting with their feet. So there we go. I've sorted on attitudes to attendance. That's very quickly highlighted the children that you probably ought to be working with. And again, I would suggest you go down into those greens as well. Fragile learners. We estimate that in every class there are about 1 in 5 who are fragile. What do I mean by this? These are the children who are attaining well and not behaviorally difficult, but when they come to a test, sometimes seem to do badly. And you will hear that statement at the top. How can we protect them? How can we identify them? And how can we protect them? Well, one way is to use PASS data with something like assessment or CAT data, plot those two together into a scattergram, and it's those children on the right in the amber square there who need some help to build up their belief in themselves, their self-confidence, in order to push them up into that top green corner. Similarly, the ones who have plenty of self-confidence but are not attaining well, they would benefit from some kind of targeted study support to improve them. There's a similar type of scattergram you can do here, where you're matching the curriculum with skills and abilities, and again in this case you're trying to get all your children in that central zone in order to balance their ability and their skill with the demands of the curriculum, and PASS can help you with that. As you will have seen in the bar chart that I showed you at the beginning of the young man who was about to be excluded, if you work through there, you will see that although each PASS factor is statistically independent of each other, you can make some interesting combinations and have a look at those. And the one thing I would say here is that there are always surprises. That's space and with some suggestions as to what you can do. You do this by keying back in the scores, the percentile scores for an individual, along with their personal data, and what will come out of that will be a list of suggested interventions for the low scoring factors. Some of those are ones that we have had ranked by schools using the intervention system regularly, and they have said these ones we know work, and some are randomly suggested. The reason for this is because the online intervention system is not an automatic system that says here's your problem, here's your answer. This is more simply to make suggestions for you to think about some of which you may say, well, we're already doing that. Others will hopefully give you an idea of what to do, and then you can try those with those children that you want to work with. So the intervention system is there to help you. And that brings me to the end of this seminar. Thank you very much for listening. I've got 3 email addresses for you to work with. That's mine at the top there. Andy Kendall is my customer services manager, and if you have any questions about the process or the report or anything to do with PASS, then do please email Andy. James Neal is our business development manager, so if you've got commercial questions to ask, he's your man. And we have a lot of information on the website, which I would encourage you to go and have a look at. So at this point, I'll say thank you very much. We did have one question about when PASS can be used, and the answer is that PASS is standardized across the whole year. So actually you can do it at any point in the year, but what I would suggest is you try to avoid times of stress, such as just before exams or just before holidays, or sometimes when the children will not be in their normal state, if you like, but also try and pick a time that you can replicate year on year. So when you make comparisons, you're trying to make the comparison in as similar a state as possible. So that's one question.
Yes, and we also have, can tasks be repeated in the same year to show any change or progress?
Now, there is a minimum retest time between PASS assessments of 10 to 12 weeks, or roughly a term. So you can reassess an individual or a group on a termly basis in order to measure the impact of intervention that you've put in between. But we would certainly not encourage you to reassess in a shorter time period than that.
Okay, and then we have another question, which is how can PASS be used with CAP 4? This is a question from Joy. She is specifically looking at how learning style section can work together with the attitudes presented in PASS.
Thank you, Joy. I think I partly answered that earlier on with my section on my bit on fragile learners. What CAT will tell you is where a child, what a child's ability ought to enable them to achieve. What PASS will tell you is perhaps where some of the barriers are within that child's mind as to what's going on, and within that you should be able to identify different people's barriers. So one child, if you assess 2 children and they may come up with identical PASS scores, nevertheless when you put intervention into place and reassess, you'll almost certainly find that they are very different on the second assessment, and that is because of their different learning styles, and that will so PASS will help you to identify that, which is great because different students do have different ways of learning, and it's important that we identify those and work with them.